Unit 7 is all about events. It will be run by myself and Jeff, who you heard is on the line. If you go to our overview slide, Jeff, here's an overview of what we'll be covering. One thing that I want to mention at this stage is that this is the last webinar on channels. So for those of you, you've all been with us from the start. We've covered publications, or writing rather. We've covered websites, we've covered podcasts, social media. What we'll do next week is look at strategy. So how to mix these channels to get your message out there and how to evaluate it. So this is our last one on channels. What I'll talk about is what makes a good event. I'll then talk you through the common in-person events, I guess, the events where you're inviting people to a venue. Jeff will then cover the more alternative style events, which include things like webinars, which is what we're doing at the moment. I will then spend a little bit of time on things that you can do to help prepare an event so that the least amount of things go wrong. And then Jeff will end with some information or taking you through rather how to extend the reach of your events. So what you can do so that when the people, when the chairs are packed up and people go home, you can continue that dialogue, that debate that you've created through your event. So let's get started. Let's remind ourselves of what an event is, because I think that it's actually one of the most, it's a quite peculiar type of communications channel. It's unlike a lot of the other channels that we've talked about in the course. The formal definition of an event, let me get it here, is a thing that happens or takes place, especially one of importance. So in other words, it's an occasion. There's a certain amount of formality to an event, a certain set of rituals around an event that just aren't the same as in other channels. And when you're asking somebody to attend an event, be it a wedding or a panel event at your think tank, you're pretty much asking them to give up around 3 hours or more of their time. So whether your event is only an hour long, when you're asking them to attend, they're traveling to your venue, they're probably getting there a bit beforehand to sit down. They're then traveling home. So it's a lot more engagement that you're asking from them rather than engagement in a Twitter post that might be a sort of split-second engagement. An event is also, at least the traditional kind, the one where you invite people to a venue, you've got a speaker, is also one of the times that your organisation is most on show. So while, all communications should be made as slick as possible and have good messaging, etc., events tend to be where your brand is sort of under the microscope in a way that doesn't compare to other channels. You're inviting them into where you, if you're hosting at your own organisation, you're inviting them to your venue. The other thing is that events are quite unique because audiences are engaging in an event for all sorts of different reasons. So if you publish a policy brief or a briefing note on your website, people are going to download that often because they are interested in the topic that you've put out there or the person that's written it. When people come to an event, they might be not particularly coming because of the report that you're launching. They might be coming because of the big name that you've drawn to be part of the panel. They might be coming to network because they want a job at your think tank. So there's lots of different reasons why people attend events, and And it's important to understand that, and to help, and in order to understand that so that you can cater to what they want a bit better. You can even use the time at the beginning of an event to get some feedback about this very thing. So if people want more networking space and they communicate that to you either informally at the beginning of an event or through feedback forms that you might give to them at the end, then try and create it. If people want more opportunities to engage in the debate that's been created, then try and offer that through blogs or through ways of linking people up. Similarly, on a sort of practical level, if you're getting feedback or you're seeing that the room is too crowded, then explore bigger venues. Feedback is really important, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So if you go to the next slide. So why events? Think tanks remain quite taken by this format. There's a lot of different reasons why. If you look at a think tank's organisational strategy, it says, these 5 points sort of capture what they tend to say they want to do with events. So their strategies often say they want to create a space for interesting people to talk to each other, to allow researchers, importantly, to disseminate new research, to promote dialogue and debate, perhaps on a topic that's not getting much airtime, to give a voice to a group who might not necessarily get one. That's very much what the Rift Valley Institute does here in Nairobi through their Rift Valley Forum. They're all about providing a voice to groups that don't often sit at kind of these big event tables. And you might be running events to provide snapshots of current thinking on a topic. So you may convene an event around a topical issue, bring a set of experts together and talk about that. What isn't on this list is that often think tanks run events because donors want them to run events. So it's quite an important thing to note when we get to the sort of the objective section of why you've chosen this particular communications channel. It's one of the main things that donors ask for as an output apart from the report itself. So that's often why think tanks are also running events. So what makes a good event? There are two basic ingredients. They're actually quite difficult, but there are two ingredients that bring you a good event. The first is having a clear goal. In other words, being clear about the purpose of the event or how the event fits in your wider dissemination strategy. And the second thing is planning. And communications staff have a really key and important role to play in both of these areas, especially in pushing researchers that have come to you with the idea of running an event to really think about what they want to get out of that event. Do they want to just launch their report? So is it very much a sort of broadcasting objective? Or is it really about promoting a sort of discussion around something? And depending on the answer to these questions, your event's going to look very different. So when you're thinking about your goal, the purpose of your event, ask yourself or push back on the researcher who is coming to you and wants to run an event, and ask yourself a number of questions. And these can be, and these include, why an event? Why do you need an event as part of your dissemination strategy? Why have you chosen this format? So often think tanks choose the panel format because they just know, they're just familiar with it. It's safer. It feels easier. But remember, and as we'll get to in a minute, panels work well for broadcasting a message. But if you're serious about promoting a discussion, they may not be the right format for you. The other question to ask when planning is why now? If your report has finished in sort of early December, mid-December, do you really want to run an event this close to Christmas? Ask yourself, why have you chosen that particular speaker? Is there someone who might convey the material a bit better, more compellingly? Also ask, and this is often goes unnoticed, who do you want in the audience? Because getting people on your speaker list is important. You know, getting good speakers is important, but getting the right people to participate is often as important than securing that big name. So that's the I guess having a goal part of this. The second thing is, of course, planning. And when you've got your goal sorted out, the good news is that the planning bit is much easier. Of course, the planning benefits from checklists and having processes in place. And as I said, we'll get that to that in a minute. But when you've got a goal, when you know why you're running an event, planning can come a lot easier. I guess the main message before we move on is that it's really important to put the time into planning your event, because winging it with events rarely works. There's too many moving parts, and something often goes wrong. So trying to foresee those issues and having systems in place to mitigate them is a good idea. Next slide. So there's a couple of tips that I'd want to run through. Some of these you will be very familiar with because many of you will have run events, of course, before. The first is to avoid all male panels. There's a lot of backlash, or there has been a lot of backlash over the last years against all male panels, and rightfully so. In our sector, Owen Barder, a well-known development economist, has been at the forefront of this pushback, and the pledge is sort of his campaign against that, and he basically refuses to sit on all male panels. The Tacanej, or No Thanks campaign, is the Scandinavian equivalent. And you've also got groups like Gender Avenger who name and shame organisations that repeatedly use all male panels and to the exclusion of women in public dialogue. You could apply the same sort of thinking to the fact that panels can sometimes look quite pale. So in other words, they can be full of white experts. So do think about the optics when you're deciding on your speaker. It can be something that gets missed, but then is very, very visible and stark when the event is already running and when it's too late. The second thing is to mix up speaker formats. What I mean by that is, let's say you've picked the panel format, so you've got 3 to 4 speakers with 10 minutes presentation. Don't have them all doing a PowerPoint. Try and mix up somebody doing using a PowerPoint and somebody using a more sort of anecdotal or story-based format. It can make an event very dry if you keep everything very, very similar. It can also end up being quite boring. So try and mix up the speaker styles, even if the amount of time that they've got to speak is quite similar. The third thing that I'd highly recommend is to plant a few questions. If you've got a Q&A at the end of your event, there's nothing more awkward than opening up your event to questions and for there to be complete silence out there in the audience. The other thing is that if the first question is asked, it makes people a lot more comfortable are asking their questions, so it kind of breaks the ice. The fourth tip is that tea time, as I've put here, is not just about the biscuits. What I mean by that is that it's really important to create networking opportunities for people, and to create those spaces, not just as tack-on things that happen as at the end of an event, but as real spaces that give people a chance to exchange ideas. I remember when I was at ODI, our events would draw people from all over the country, down to London, sometimes all over Europe. And one of the most important things that was reported to us as an important element of our events was, in fact, the networking opportunity. The time at the end to speak to other people in the audience and the speakers. And finally, just a reminder of what I said earlier, it's one of the most direct interactions you've got with your audiences. So don't waste it and don't mess it up. And here's what I mean by the last point. Next slide. Now, by don't mess it up, I mean that, as I said, your brand has never been more sort of out there, so it's important to look good. You don't need to spend a lot of money on big flashy banners for your events, but having a few pop-up banners printed that are sort of generic and can be used across the events that you run in your organization is quite useful. Or even if you've not got that, just having a set of PowerPoint slides on loop with information about your organization, perhaps the hashtag that's linked to the event, perhaps your website, your research areas, reports that are coming out soon. Also think through the user experience, and this is why I've put these images up here. Think of, just as you would when you're designing a website or thinking through the layout of a publication, think through the experience of somebody coming to your building or to the venue that you've chosen. It sounds really silly, but is there enough parking? Are there enough seats? You can see up here on the image to the left, there's people standing. Standing room only is great for a concert, but it's really irritating if you've made the time investment to come to an event and you end up awkwardly standing at the side of a room. If you're running your event at night, so if it's sort of an evening event, is there somebody that's going to be at reception to welcome your guests? Oftentimes the receptionist finishes at 5. They often aren't really going to care much about the fact that there's an event unless you've specifically asked them to stay on. Think about whether your cleaning staff are going to be blocking the hallway blocking the hall into your venue. I've been to half a dozen events in recent years where there have been cleaning buckets and signs that you've had to step around. It all matters. You wouldn't leave these details out if you were planning your own wedding, so don't do it for this big occasion. The other thing is to not waste the fact that you've brought people all the way to your venue. And what I mean by that is that if you're launching a report, that's fine. Obviously, make sure you have copies of the report or information about how to access it, but also have copies of other reports that may be linked to that topic or or have been produced by that particular section of your research organization. And make sure, obviously, to capture who is coming to your event through things like checklists, through things like registration forms. If you can, elicit feedback, again, through either informal chats or more formal feedback forms. Next slide. If you're really looking to do something interesting or new with your events, this is something that I've seen done a few times of late, which is to basically use the dead time of people kind of waiting around for the event to start, to create a bit of an installation that might highlight one of the key messages or the key message from your publication. So here's one about the sheer amount of plastic that's ending up in our oceans. Yes, this would have been a rather expensive installation to have in place, but you don't need to do something as flashy. You can just be creative. But just be aware that there's usually about 20 minutes before and after your event where people are going to be standing around. So get them to read stuff, put stuff, as I've said, on a looped presentation on PowerPoint if you need to. Last set of slides in terms of tips for success. I'll run through these a bit quicker. The first is to have several backup plans or fallback things. That includes having perhaps a fallback speaker or a fallback chair, spare microphones, extra printouts of things. When people start arriving, people tend to get a bit panicked, and so having backups and extra things printed is quite important. Stick to time. Events that overrun can make people feel a bit trapped, especially if they're in the middle of the room and they feel as though they can't leave. So do try and have a chair that can help people stick to time, and if necessary, use the networking session or the drinks reception after your event as an opportunity to continue a discussion. Don't underestimate how many people it takes to put on a good event. It's usually not just your communications and research staff. You're usually relying on administrators, on project staff, on receptionists to welcome people, on caterers, on your director perhaps to be the chair. Many of these people get overlooked, so try and avoid this by having a bit of a clear picture of who's involved in the event, briefing them all beforehand, and crucially involving them in an after-action review. They often have quite valuable insights that might be missed. The fourth is to consider the optics. I've already mentioned staying away from all male or all white panels, but it's worth thinking about other stuff as well. The UN here in Nairobi ran an event some years ago on the Somali famine. They hosted it at one of the poshest restaurants in Nairobi and gave delegates a 5-course meal, and got absolutely hammered by the media for doing that because it just quite obviously was not appropriate. And finally, the other thing is to bear in mind that a 10% dropout rate is quite common. So a lot of organisations have a bit of wiggle room in terms of oversubscription, so that you can cater or account for the fact that about 10% people won't show up. It might be different in different contexts, so just be aware of that. And the final thing is to evaluate. You can do the best thing I've found with events is a very quick after-action review, and we'll be talking about after-action reviews in more depth next week. Another thing you can use is an attendance and engagement log, or just have a chat with people at the end of an event. It doesn't have to be a sort of formal survey. It can just be a quick chat, asking them how they thought it went. So those are kind of some top tips. Let's move to the next slide. Before we go into the common think tank event styles, I just want to highlight this wonderful quote that came out of a WonkComs event in London, which is that events shouldn't be seen as a one-off thing. They need to be part of a wider program or organizational strategy. Jeff, as I said earlier, will talk about how to extend the reach of your events through things like blogs and event videos. But it's really important to not see an event as a one-off thing. As it says here, think about your events program as a continuation of a wider conversation that both predates and postdates the actual event itself. If you're really wanting to sort of engage people around your research, a one-off launch is often not going to achieve that. So I'm going to stop here and take some questions. Do feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question, or use the chat box.
While we're maybe waiting for others, can I ask a very basic one?
Sure.
Which was, you mentioned an engagement log, which was not something that I'm sure I've known before, or maybe I call it something else. Can you describe what that is?
It's basically a log. I mean, it's apart from obviously having details of who's attended, so a basic registration of names. It might be also logging how engaged people were in terms of asking questions and that kind of thing. It's basically just a quick report about how the event went, whether the format worked for that particular event. So it's something that you may keep within your comms team, have an informal conversation about through your after action review.
Nice. I have a few random thoughts that I could also add here if there aren't other questions. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I also like about events is you were talking about a number of different reasons why people host events. From a communications perspective, or I don't know, let's say it's from a communications perspective. A lot of times it can be difficult to get researchers, because of the nature of the research process, which is often changing and variable, to be very good at deadlines. But I find that when you have an event, people don't want to be completely embarrassed in public. And so they can be a good way of creating kind of an artificial deadline that people actually stick to, because they really don't want to look a fool in public, basically. So there might be other internal reasons for why you might want to host events. You're talking about thinking about how you get the right audience. I think that that's a really important thing to be evaluating as you're going along, and why keeping track of who's attending is so important. I know that there was one think tank that I was speaking with that said, we keep on getting the same 12 students that are coming to our event. And it's not to say that students aren't a good group to have at your events. In fact, they can become really loyal kind of customers, for lack of a better word. But what they ended up starting to do was to actually send, instead of, they realized that basically they were announcing an event to their entire mailing list, and then the first people who signed up were the first people who signed up, and then it was full. And so what they started doing was thinking about who do we actually want to come to the event, inviting them first, and then doing a kind of general release. So you might want to think about things like that. You mentioned have spares of everything. As someone who works on the technology side a lot of times, I would also add spare batteries and spare charging cables and all that sort of a thing. That's one of those things that I find that electricity and power are can be one of those things that can really catch you out. In the same way, and this is maybe about preparing the room, be thinking about, if it's a really long event, that there are power cables and things or PowerPoints that people can actually use, because you find so many times people are hanging out around the edges of the events so that they can actually connect their computer or their laptop. So those were a few things to that I thought of. I see that we do have a question.
Yeah, I just saw one pop up. What kind, it's a great question. Thanks, Sarah. What kind of promotional preparatory info about the topic tends to encourage people to attend? Teasers only or some meaty key findings? That's a good question. In my experience, the launch of the report on, at least digitally, has happened in advance of the event. So people have actually had the report to look at beforehand. But Jeff, have you, what's been your experience with the Nuffield Trust?
I mean, it depends on, we actually don't really do a lot of launch events, or we didn't, I still don't.
When you worked there.
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm talking as though you're still there.
What I was going to say is that it also can depend on the type of event that you're holding. So I think I've mentioned it somewhere in here where if you're holding a debate, for example, it can be really good to have some sort of framing piece where you have some of the key arguments, but leave the arguments unresolved, so people want to come and join in the debate, or have something like a poll where people can be voting for it in advance, and then you can reveal if people have changed their minds once they've joined the debate and things like that. So yeah, I don't think that you necessarily, sometimes not giving away everything is good, but sometimes it can be really beneficial to have quite a bit actually available before the event.
It also, I think, as you said, depends on the style of event you've chosen. For a keynote speech, you're obviously not going to be, you know, your main teaser is going to be the big name that you may have been able to pull. Whereas if you're wanting to promote discussion around a topic, you may want to be sending quite a lot of information to people to engage with beforehand, so that the discussion is particularly rich. So I guess it also depends on the type of event, and we're going to get onto that in a moment. Are there any other questions? But thanks very much for that, Sarah. So let's move on then to the different types of events. Now, as I said, I'm going to talk about the old school events, you know, the events with a venue and where people are actually physically in a room. Jeff will talk about the more unconventional or alternative types of events in the next bit. So let's go to the following slide. Yeah. So overwhelmingly, there are two types of events that think tanks tend to use, but please feel free to jump in if there are other styles or formats that you use. But no matter where you are in the world, I see these two types of events. The first is the panel. The second is the keynote style event. So let's look at the panel first. This is kind of what it looks like. You will probably have been to one. You may have organized one. It's a very, very common type of event for think tanks. It's basically where you get about 3 to 4 speakers and you give them 10 to 15 minutes to say their thing, and you have questions at the end. As I've said a few times, the panel format is a really good option if you're looking at sort of broadcasting a message. So if you're launching a report and maybe you're complementing the launch of your report with a few other perspectives to give it balance. So speaker one might provide an overview of the research findings and maybe a researcher from your organization, and then the other speakers may give other perspectives, as I said, to provide a bit of balance. There might even be counter perspectives to make it feel like there's more of a debate. I've also seen it work well for where you're convening an event around a topical issue, where you get a bunch of experts to have a sort of debate with a volleying question and answer format. But for this, you need quite a good chair. In fact, for all panel events to be successful, it's really important to have a strong chair who can A, keep people to time, and B, pick up on key discussion points that can be discussed in the Q&A, and also to keep the Q&A in check, make sure that people aren't standing up making long statements and using up all the Q&A time. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, is to mix presentation styles. So don't have everybody doing a PowerPoint. If possible, mix that up a bit. If you go to the next slide, it gives you a bit of a summary of what the panel event looks like, when it can be used, a few tips, and in terms of room setup, as you saw in the picture beforehand, it tends to be a theatre or cabaret style setup with a presentation screen at the front. So that's the basic look and feel of the panel event. The second type of event that think tanks tend to run, if you go to the next slide, is the keynote style event. It's a very popular format for think tanks. This is where you've got a big name, as you can see here. We've got Leonardo DiCaprio talking for an extended period about something interesting, and you usually do this rather than using it as a way to sort of launch your research. It's usually done by think tanks to raise their profile, to show that you've got pulling power. You can get these big names into your organization to speak. And apart from the tips, if you go to the next slide, Jeff, apart from the tips that you can see here in terms of how to make use of a good keynote event, which is to make sure that a senior member of your organization introduces the speaker and handles the Q&A session if there is one. One thing I would say is to use the big name to promote your event. If you've already secured this person, let's say you've managed to get Leonardo DiCaprio to speak at your environmental summit, then use that person to as much as you can. So use their name as much as possible. And one way you can do this is by creating a quick promotional video that with them in it that you could share through your networks, or indeed to ask them to make it known through their networks that they're going to be speaking at this event. So use the big name. The second is to brief your speaker about your audience, what to expect. They may be very senior, but it's always nice to have a bit of a briefing about what the context is, what sorts of questions might come up. The other thing to say is that even though I've put here that it's good to have a senior member of your organization top and tailing the session and handling a Q&A, keynote events or keynote speeches aren't usually a space for in-depth debate and discussion. There might be a few questions and answers. So just be aware of that. It's not going to be somewhere that's got an extended amount of time to debate a topic. So that might not be the most appropriate format for that. The final thing in terms of setup for your room, this usually requires a large room. So you may be looking at an external venue if your organization doesn't have a very large meeting room, and it's usually set up theatre style. So that's your keynote event. A final event that's growing quite popular is the media roundtable. And I like this, this type of event because you're sort of, it ticks off on your sort of media engagement activities as well as helping you to disseminate your research. It looks a bit like this, or it could look a bit like the picture on the next slide, which is a bit more informal. As we know, the media play a big role in shaping the policy messages that we're sharing with our audiences, and in some cases amplifying the research that think tanks are producing. So it's important to develop a relationship with journalists and to not sort of be afraid of them, and to, if possible, not just use the very tired and slightly boring sort of press release, issuing press release format to engage with them. But one thing to be clear on is that a media roundtable is not a press conference. It's the focus here is less on broadcasting a message or on disseminating the latest findings of a report. But it's more about developing a relationship with a selected group of journalists by having a conversation. If you go to the next slide, you can kind of see what a media table looks like and what it is. It's an intimate event to connect journalists to experts. It's not a press conference as such. It doesn't have to be planned or hosted around the publication of a big report. You would use it to raise the profile of your organization. So to make your organization known, to have your organization on their radar as somebody that they can come to for commentary on certain topics, as well as to build relationships with the press. So to get a sense of the journalists that are covering topics, covering the areas that you're working on. In terms of tips, media roundtables, as with panel discussions, as with any event, actually require a strong chair. But this chair does need to have a lot of general knowledge about your key research areas. And so oftentimes the head of your communications team, if you have one, is quite a good person to choose as your chair for this. Or indeed, if you can get them, your director. It also helps to vet the people that are being invited and who are attending quite carefully. And you can do that these days relatively easily by looking at what that journalist has published, maybe what they're saying on Twitter. In terms of the room setup, this is usually a sort of a smaller event. So you're looking at a small room, boardroom style, with sort of breakout space for mingling. In terms of getting them interested in attending, because journalists often want something, they want to get a story out of the time that they put in to go along to something. One of the ways that you can get them to your event is perhaps to provide off-the-record briefings along with some on-the-record stuff about what you're about to release, sort of preliminary findings of key research. As I said, the focus here is on connections, though. It's not on publicizing your latest report. The idea is to develop the relationships that you need in order for the publicity around your report to be made a bit easier, and for it to have more of a chance to be picked up. Okay, next slide. Okay, yes. Over to Jeff, and then I'll come back to you after this session on sort of planning and preparation for events.
Great, thank you, Carolina. Yes, so those were a few of your more typical events that think tanks run. I wouldn't go as far as to say that the events that I'm going to talk about don't exist in the physical world at all, but hopefully there may be more formats and things you might not be as familiar with. So there are 5 different types of event that I'm going to talk about: the Fishbowl, the World Cafe, the webinar, which you better be familiar with at this point, and the Twitter chat. In terms of the Fishbowl, I suppose the irony here is that Carolina has actual photos of her events and my alternative events. I think it's difficult to capture a picture of a fishbowl, but so I've got these little images instead. The concept behind a fishbowl, as hopefully this image kind of hints at, is that it is a more participatory sort of meeting, and where you have a group that's, in this case, physically in the center, who are talking and discussing about an issue, while people in the outer circle are observing. It's a kind of mechanism and a process that I think has both been attributed back to Icelandic culture and Inuit culture, and I don't know, I guess I'll just say various places up north, and apologies for my lack of knowledge of exactly where this originates. But it can be a really useful approach, especially when you're having or discussing a particularly contentious issue, because the idea is that it gives people who are in that center circle a chance to actually have their voices and opinions heard, while those other people are, yeah, basically observing it and having a chance to hear those alternative opinions. There are a few different ways that you can set up a fishbowl. One of the ways that you might, basically it's either open or closed. In a closed fishbowl, you keep those people who are in the center there for the entire time, basically. On the other hand, and I find this quite an interesting approach, and one that I've done a few times before with success, is to have an open fishbowl. And there are a couple of different ways of having an open fishbowl. One is what I call the empty chair method. So you might have a group of a couple of experts, a moderator, and then an empty chair where anybody who's in that outer circle can come up and join anyway. And I think this is a good way to get different voices into the discussion. And the challenge that I'm sure many of you have seen with something like a panel event is where you have, sure, a panel of experts sitting up in the front, but there's often a lot of expertise around the room. And that's what having this open fishbowl method kind of allows us to do, is to harness the expertise that is around the room, so that you don't get a situation like where you have a panel meeting and then you open it up for question and answers. I think on one end of the spectrum, you can have nobody asking questions. On the other end of the spectrum, you have somebody who holds the floor for 5 minutes and is not actually asking a question, but rather feels like they want to contribute. And, you know, that's fine, but actually having them involved in a session like this in a fishbowl style is a way of basically dealing with that. The other open fishbowl format is to have basically a tap out method. So the idea is that instead of having kind of one empty chair where people come in and different people are rotating through that one chair, but there's consistency with a few of the participants, the tap out method is just somebody comes in and taps people on the shoulder at an appropriate point, maybe a pause in conversation. They then leave the circle and that person now enters the circle. And I think that that's a really great way of evolving a conversation. You won't be surprised to hear that, like Carolina said, one of the most important things is always about having a good chair or a moderator for these. And I think that the thing that's really important as well on this is that you have the ability to actually explain this to people, and you dedicate some of your event time to explaining how this format works. Because it's really, you want to be very careful not to have your event break down in chaos. And similarly, like Carolina was saying, in terms of having a planted question, it might be worth prepping one person to come up and join the circle in the first instance to kind of get people to feel comfortable about how this works. In terms of the room setup, it really is literally supposed to be some people in the center of a circle and people observing in an outer circle. But it is just as possible, if you are constrained by the way that your room is set up, to have the the main discussants in the front of a room. The question that you would have there is you wouldn't necessarily want them on a stage or something that creates a lot of separation and distance from the audience. You know, in this particular case, you're trying to make the audience also feel involved, even if they're not necessarily always saying something. So maybe not a stage, but a little dais could be important. One of the things that's also really important is to think a little bit about the sound. So in the particular one that I was, one of the ones that I was doing this with, we were in a rather large room, and we also had simultaneous translation. And in order to have simultaneous translation work, we had to make sure that everybody was speaking into a microphone. So obviously, if you have people coming in and out, whether it's the empty chair approach or the rotation approach, you can't have everybody mic'd up with lapel mics. It just isn't going to work. So if you do need a microphone, make sure that you're thinking about wireless mics. The other, I think that's broadly the point. I see that there's a message in the chat. Right, there have been a couple of questions here. So first of all, Reuven says, I've been to a physical panel event recently that used an empty chair approach very effectively to bring in expertise from the audience in and out of the discussion. I think it really can be a very useful thing. And I think what's nice about this approach, even having that empty chair approach, is that otherwise, in a panel event, one of the things about being a good moderator is kind of being informed about who is in the room. And you can say, oh, would you like to comment on that? Well, if you don't know the people in the room, it's difficult to know what their areas of expertise is or where they might want to come in. And that's what's useful about having this sort of approach, where people can effectively volunteer to come in when they have something that they are wanting to say. The question from Carolina was, with the tap out style, is it first in, first out? You can create different rules, and that's why kind of having an explanation is, is really useful. So there are different ways of doing it. So you might have people kind of form a queue, and when somebody feels like they're ready to leave, they can go and they can do it that way. Or yes, you can have it as a first in, first out. You can. The important thing is, again, just to make sure that people understand what your format is, so that chaos does not ensue. I've not had one of these break down in chaos, having said that. But yeah, those are a couple of different ways of doing that. Another event style that probably a lot of you are familiar with, but is still a really good way of getting lots of information in it can be a relatively short period of time, and a period of time that is somewhat more condensed anyway, is the World Cafe style. And the concept behind the World Cafe is maybe you have a certain number of stations, and traditionally they are kind of circular cafe tables that can fit 8 to 10 people around them. But I've done it just as effectively with poster presentations and even having various actual presentations if you have enough screens to go around a room. But you kind of want to give people enough distance so that each of those tables becomes a separate conversation. And the idea behind this one is that, for example, if you have an hour to get through a lot of different information, and you have, let's say, 8 different presenters, what you would do is have maybe 3 sessions of 15 minutes plus 5 minutes for changing between the different sessions. So actually, there's one presenter at each of these tables that never leaves, and who would give the presentation 3 times, but in a more intimate format that allows people to feel a little bit more comfortable, an ability to engage, ask questions, rather than having people be in a plenary and think, oh, is it okay to ask a question or not? So I think it's really good at making things more intimate. Also, if you have 8 presentations and maybe only 3 sessions of it, it's a good way to make sure that people are going to the sessions that they're most interested in, rather than having to maybe sit through something that they are, well, less interested in. In terms of the World Cafe, like I said, they're really good for creating kind of smaller conversations. The thing that's really important here is probably less of a moderator, but more of a timekeeper. And also that that there's some sort of clear map or something that kind of explains where each of the tables are. I have done World Cafes where you just are kind of split into groups and then you rotate through once or twice or three times. That is one way of doing it. Or you can have that open approach where people can choose which sessions that they want to attend. But if you have that second approach, then you really need to make sure that people know where they're going. And either you need kind of tall signs on the table that says this is table 1, or this is the table that is about whatever topic, about events, let's say. The other thing that this requires is a little bit of a heads up to the presenters. I think sometimes they go into this and they agree, yeah, I'll do a World Cafe, it's just an easy chat or whatever. And they don't realize that they have to give that same chat multiple times. So it's always good to prepare your presenters that way. The next one is one that I enjoy very much, which is kind of an alternative presentation format. It is not necessarily, I mean, you could use this just as equally in a panel event if you wanted to, but you can use it just for individual presentations. And the concept behind it is that it is 20 slides that advance automatically after 20 seconds. So you basically set in PowerPoint, there's a way that you can set the transition timing, and you set it to 20 seconds and they all automatically advance. And that means that you have presentations that last 6 minutes and 40 seconds long exactly. And it's a really good way of forcing the presenters to think through what they're really trying to say and to compress that information into that allotted time. It definitely keeps people from running over and taking more time than they're allotted. So I don't have, I'm not going to spend time here to play an example of it, but there is a resource sheet that we will send around at the end of this meeting, or this webinar rather, that kind of gives you an idea of what these, a link to the Petracucha website. It is a little bit of a cult community, I think I can say that, where they have these Petracucha meetups around the globe to practice basically telling stories in this exact format. But it's, I guess what I'll leave you with is just forcing people to put one idea per slide is also a really good way to get people to basically remove a bunch of the text that might otherwise be on the slide. And because it advances automatically, timings might not be exactly right. So I think that creates kind of a little bit of a more lighthearted sort of just atmosphere, because people screw up, they make jokes, they have fun, and they keep going. And that's all okay, that's part of it. On the other hand, it does really force them to prepare for these presentations, which can also be a good thing. Another one of the formats that, like I said, I'm pretty sure you should all be familiar with at this point is the webinar. And webinars are basically taking any one of these approaches, the lecture or that sort of format, into the online space. They are particularly useful for if you are looking to extend the geographic reach of whatever your event is going to be. Because as we have today, we have people from Canada, from the UK, from Austria, from Zambia, from Kenya, and wherever you may be, we're all here participating together, which is, I think really great. And I think one of the things that's been really wonderful about this is that this is a technology that has evolved, I would say within probably the last 5 years even, to become something that is actually possible, that we can do these live interactions around. The a few tips with this. It's important to have as strong of an internet connection as possible. Oftentimes I recommend to people who are presenting in the webinar that they actually use a wired internet connection rather than Wi-Fi. I'm breaking all the rules today because I am on Wi-Fi and I'm not wearing my headphones, but that can be another great thing to help avoid feedback. There are a number of different technologies that exist now for producing webinars. You obviously know that for the Think Tank School here, we use Zoom. Zoom I like because it's a relatively lightweight platform. It doesn't have a lot of things that are involved on it. And I'm going to say touch wood, it's a relatively stable platform. So I think we've had a few instances where there's been some internet latency or a few issues where the recording is cut out, but those are thankfully few and far between. And they don't officially require other people to install things on their computer. And there's also kind of a mobile device version or for your tablet or whatever. So you can actually participate in these webinars on the run. I know I've done that before. There are other ones like GoToWebinar has quite a significant price tag, but is also very good and stable and has lots of features. There are other ones like ClickWebinar, which we found relatively good. We used to use that for the school, but also WebEx you might have heard of before. So there are a lot of different options, and it kind of depends on what you're looking for. But I do like Zoom, and they do actually have a free version that limits meetings to just 40 minutes, but is something that is available if you are tight on cash. And one other way of having kind of an event that is not bringing everybody together in the room is through Twitter chats. And I've used Twitter chats in this particular case, but you can do it just as equally on a Facebook page, or this is something that Guardian has done really well on in some of their different communities that they have, as bringing together to basically have a chat discussion on their website. And this is one of those examples where it's really useful to have quite a solid description of what you're going to discuss, or maybe outline some of the key points to get people started and to get people thinking about it. Now, Twitter chats are not something where it just happens, just like any other event. You need to advertise it with a specific time. And at least on Twitter, you need to have a very agreed hashtag, basically, because that's how people are going to find the conversation. And again, like any other event, I think people think, oh, it's just a Twitter chat, you don't need a moderator. Of course you need a moderator, it's an event. The moderator can go through and be prompting specific questions, or if, for example, it's a very lively debate or discussion, maybe the Twitter feed is updating very quickly and some of the people who are busy otherwise answering questions didn't notice them, so they can use, the moderator can be busy looking for other questions. Yes, so the few little tips and tricks on this one is it's really good to use for having conversations across wider geographies. They don't require as much bandwidth, so that's great if you're in an environment or trying to reach someone where maybe they only have access on their mobile phones. And what's also kind of fun about Twitter chats in particular is that they are more public in nature. Obviously, if it's on a Facebook page, or there are ways of making this kind of a closed group chat that I'm happy to discuss if we want to go into it. But I guess the nice thing about that discussion is that it then becomes on the public record and people see the hashtag, especially if maybe various of their social network is participating in it, and then they can join in too, and all of that good thing. Yes. The other thing that I would say about this is maybe you've heard of the Reddit approach to this, which is kind of a similar concept called Ask Me Anything, where basically they get various personalities in, and they can ask them anything, and the questions are then kind of ranked by or voted on by the audience, and that tends to be what they are actually viewing. So that is an overview of a few different events that you may or may not already have been aware of. We thought that given that this is a webinar all about events, that we might try and open this up rather than necessarily doing a particular poll, but to have a discussion about these. I know that Reuven, you've already shared, and please others continue to do so as well. But some of the questions are, have you used any of these events? Have they been effective? Are there things that you would never do again? Are there any other tips or tricks that we've missed? And one of my favorite questions on this is any horror stories that we can all learn from. We usually get a few good ones of those. And are there other event types in particular that we've missed or that you maybe want us to discuss? So things like the World Cafe we didn't have before, and we've now added into this session because we had feedback saying, oh yeah, let us know a little bit more about this sort of event. So with that, maybe I'll open up the floor to questions. If you want to be as brave as to unmute your mic, you're always welcome. Otherwise, the chat box is there, and I believe Carolina has put her video on and is ready to add her 2 cents.
No, I just remember, was the only thing was that I remember from last year, what was one of the horror stories about a panelist bursting into tears? Was that one? That was awful.
And I think
there are various things that you can do to mitigate against the horrors that might come up in an event, but I couldn't really think of a way to get around that particular instance.
Well, I think that I mean,
other than maybe, sorry, go on.
Oh, I don't remember the details of that one exactly, but you know, I think the point is that events can be really high stress situations that do require a lot of preparation, and people can feel really exposed. So if you prepare your presenters well in advance, that's one way of dealing with it. I have had one where the presenter didn't burst into tears on stage, kept it together until they were off stage, and then ran into the bathroom and burst into tears. And that was after a particularly hard line of questioning. And, you know, that's something where I don't think it was quite bullying, but, you know, it's one of those situations where a moderator or an effective moderator might have been able to step in and say, you know, hey, it's maybe back off a little bit, sort of a thing.
Yeah. We've got a question that's come up.
Or a comment. Yeah, Emma says, we used a World Cafe for an event a few weeks ago, and one standout piece of feedback was that our attendees wanted more time on each table. We found it hard to find the balance between time for meaningful conversation and keeping the event dynamic and moving. And that is an important question. I have no idea how long your sessions were, but I would say, as a general rule of thumb, it's always better to leave people wanting more than to leave people thinking, oh God, why am I still stuck here? So if that was your feedback, then yeah, maybe you were on the right side of that, but maybe an extra 5 minutes or something wouldn't have hurt either. We have another comment here saying, we usually do keynote events, and we have found them to be a quite effective way of having them at breakfast meetings and keeping them short, kind of within the 2 hours. Attendance have been good, and people rarely leave before the end of the event.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's quite a common event or kind of event time here in Kenya as well. Tends to work really well, and people, like you say, don't leave because we've got kind of a set time, and it's usually early enough so they don't have to be somewhere else. Any other comments?
Or horror stories. We love horror stories. I've had one where at another event where actually this one was terrible. We had the keynote, his partner died the day or something before the event, and in the chaos of all of that, did not actually inform us that he was no longer coming. So we had a really high-level event where all of a sudden we didn't have the keynote speaker, and we were only made aware of it that morning, kind of 30 minutes
Within
before the
hours, yeah.
and it was kind of like okay, great. And you couldn't fault the person whatsoever, but it was one of those things where we had to scramble around for the last minute to have an entirely backup presentation, which by chance we were able to pull something together. But from now on, when we have really big events like that, we actually always plan now to have that backup presentation, hopefully that you will never ever need, but just in case.
Oh, we've got another comment. Horror story. We were holding an event in a hotel and there was a big party in the room next door. During the keynote speak, all we could hear was the Grease medley and rockers singing.
Go Grease
the mic couldn't be heard over it. Goodness. Okay. That's a good one. Permission to use that one for future anecdotes that we share with unit participants. That's a very good one.
I'm not quite sure how you mitigate against that sort of one. I mean, obviously, try to do some. I mean, how do you mitigate against that other than really making sure that the venue is well prepared and knows what sort of a thing they have going on? But for example, right now is probably not a great time to be holding these sorts of big public events in the middle of the World Cup, because that there's going to be raucous roars and maybe everybody sitting there actually probably doing it now, watching on your mobile phones the matches and things like that. I've also had Wi-Fi go down a lot, to the extent that I now kind of bring my own pocket Wi-Fi, especially if I'm doing live streaming and things, which I will talk about later. But venues tend to think, yeah, our Wi-Fi is great, it'll all work fine. And when you get 100 people logged into it or 200 people logged into it, suddenly the whole network goes down. So it's also good to talk with presenters in advance to say, ask them if they have anything that requires internet, or if you can get them a separate connection that doesn't rely on dodgy Wi-Fi.
Okay, so thanks for joining in the discussion. This is probably the most lively bit of discussion that we've had over the last couple of units. So we're really pleased that people have joined in and given us a couple of horror stories, a couple of anecdotes. We're also pleased that we've not missed any key formats that you might have been using. It doesn't seem to have come up in the discussion. I guess what some of the things that we've been discussing here in the questions and discussion section highlight is the fact that planning is very important, and that's what we're going to be talking about now. The next couple of slides focus on how to prepare your events to avoid the horror stories, or to at least try to avoid as many issues as possible. So one of the things, and Jeff is quite aware of my obsession with things like checklists and to-do lists. I'm quite a planner. But one of the things that I find works very well with events is to have an events checklist. That it basically does what it says in the title, which is a list of things to do before, during, and after an event. It sounds really basic and really silly, but I don't think it should be underestimated, even if you run a lot of events every year. In fact, it should be something that you include for sure if your organisation is in the business of running lots of events. It's basically something that ensures that you consistently don't miss things. As I said earlier, when you're running an event, and especially on the day, there are a lot of moving parts. So some of these are out of your control, as we've discussed, but a lot of these are within your control. And having a checklist can really help you avoid catastrophe. Many of the tasks can be automated. So if you're putting the details of your event on a sort of content management system, that can feed your website, it can feed your registration software. And the tasks obviously can be divvied up. It doesn't all have to land on one person's desk. But what I would say is that in using these checklists, having one person that's in charge of sort of keeping on top of things and accountable for delivering the event is quite useful. One thing I would say also is that checklists should be amended based on sort of the internal and external evaluations that you run. So they should be tweaked according to feedback. So if people, for example, complain about a room being too crowded and that this happens sort of consistently, you can amend the checklist work stream so that if registration is full, then there can be kind of a prompt to book a larger venue, and then another prompt to announce more space to participants who have may be on a waiting list or the like. Checklists, as you can see on this next slide, will be particular to your organisation. So I've included a couple of examples from different organisations that we've worked with. But there are going to be things that are common across checklists, and in the resources for this unit that you'll get through Slack afterwards, I've included a couple of examples of the ones that different organisations use. Do feel free to adapt and share those. Adapt those and share yours if you're willing to. Another tool, and one thing to say on checklists is that sometimes it doesn't even have to be things that you do. It might even be a prompt to ask, is the panel sufficiently diverse? So going back to what I said earlier about all male panels, there may be a task within your checklist towards towards the end of the planning phase, where maybe you've started to approach speakers, that prompts you to think about, okay, is our panel, given the speakers that have accepted now, sufficiently diverse? So it kind of provides reminders as well as a list of basic things to do, like book the catering. The other resource that is very, very useful, and that a lot of organisations are starting to use, is a resources sheet for speakers and chair people. This basically provides guidance to speakers. Obviously, you'll want to be verbally briefing your speakers, your panelists, your chairs in advance of the event and just before it. But what I think is useful about a resource sheet for speakers is that it very clearly outlines the expectations that you have of them. So what you're expecting them to do, what role you're expecting them to play as a chair. Are you expecting them to be a quite passive chair that just does basic introductions, or are you expecting your chair to pick up on key themes and to kind of tease out debate? Also, important information that sometimes gets left off on length, format, and maybe even some tips on presentation style. It's particularly important to do this, not just for speakers, but for your chairperson as well, especially if that person is from outside your organisation. That's it for that. I'm going to close, and actually you can hear the dogs barking in the background. That's another thing that I'm trying to mitigate by by getting people to rein them in, but that's you have to excuse that. The final thing I want to mention is the value of thinking about running an event series. An event series is a lot of work, but it tends to provide you with a lot more engagement from your audience. So there's a lot of investment into the event series, but you get a lot out of it. And this is basically where you run a range of events over a set period on a specific theme. So it can be really focused. So it can be, for example, events. We ran an event some years ago on protecting civilians in conflict and looking at all the different angles of that particular thematic area, or it can be a little bit broader, like what the Overseas Development does with its Global Challenges series. The good thing about this is that the Global Challenges series is broad enough to bring in a lot of the research areas and perhaps break some of the silos within the organisation. So you end up having events that run that are sort of run in collaboration with different parts of the research institute. So maybe the economics and finance area, the humanitarian area, the environment and climate change area, because the broadness of the theme allows that. The value of an event series, I've kind of put a few points down here, is that it allows you to cover an issue in a lot of depth because you're basically running between, well, minimum 3 events or more on a particular topic. It also provides key speakers with some flexibility in terms of timing. So if you can't get an interesting speaker on the date for your first event, you may be able to get him or her to participate in one of the other events that form part of your event series. As I said earlier, it can be a way to break the silos within your organisation, depending on how broad you make the event series. It also provides an opportunity to be innovative about the kind of outputs you produce, because your event is spanning a longer period. Oftentimes, creating a podcast series around that event series can be a good way of doing things, or indeed, a set of blogs that follow the event series. It also makes marketing a bit easier because you're cross-posting, you're building an audience with every event that you run. One other thing in terms of event series that I've seen work well is to run different events in different locations. So that gives you the opportunity to kind of stick to be running events around a similar theme, but to have them in different locations, so you're engaging different audiences. So I would, if you haven't thought about an event series, I'd highly recommend thinking of that as a potential way to run your events. As I said, it involves lots of preparation, lots of work to think through the different angles of a theme that you might be choosing to tackle. There's quite a bit of investment in terms of time, but the engagement from your audience tends to be much greater. And you can see in the next slide, this is an example of, as I mentioned, the Global Challenges series from ODI from last year. It gives you an idea of the kind of diversity of events that were run under this banner. So I'll leave you there. I'll hand it back to Jeff. but I'll take any questions that you might have before he moves on to the section on extending the reach of your events. Okay. One, Reuven. For planning, when speakers are senior dignitaries, we had one in December with 2 provincial premiers and 1 state governor. Remember to plan to coordinate with their security folks. Yes, great point. There's not just their security point, but if they're particularly senior, you may want to be engaging their protocol staff as well, to make sure that you're introducing them correctly. But yes, that's a very good point.
We had the Princess Royale come in. We also had to scout helicopter spots where she might be able to land. So sometimes with really high profile people, you never know what you're going to be coordinating. Another event type series that I really like is actually one that we do here at Voraus, which is called Politisch, which in German is kind of bringing together the words politics and table. And we are more of a grassroots think tank, so involve a lot more kind of consultation processes as part of our research and discussion, and including this was particularly used for a project on understanding people's views on migration. But it was basically to cook a meal and get people to sit down around a table and to have a discussion about the topic as a way of kind of getting people to open up. And they did that as a road show all around Switzerland to engage people throughout. So there you go. That's another way of thinking a little bit outside the box and creating a series that added up to a really relevant publication.
And one thing to say, just on the event series, the previous slide listed, quite a substantial catalogue of events. Your event series might only be 3 events that hang together through, a particular thematic topic that you've picked. You don't have to do something as extensive as what I showed just there. So don't be afraid to use that format.
Great. I'm not seeing any other oh no, wait, sorry, there is another one. For a small organization, holding an event is obviously a big investment. Any tips on working out whether it's likely to be worth it?
It's a good question. I mean, oftentimes, when I kept restating the fact that it's a big investment, it's often a big investment in terms of time. So you're putting time into the planning, into the thinking through of how the different themes are going to play, and when the timing's going to be, because you're essentially organizing 3 events at one go. It doesn't necessarily, I don't know whether you mean a big investment in terms of money. It's often no different from hosting, hosting 3 completely separate events. What's good about it is that you often get more engagement because you're building an audience along the way. And in my experience, it has been quite a worthwhile thing to do because of the engagement that you've ended up getting. In terms of, as I mentioned earlier, marketing those sorts of events is made easier by the fact that you're cross-posting, you're making announcements about those events. But Jeff, have you got anything to add about thinking through whether, or anticipating whether something's going to be worth it?
Yeah, and there are a few things. There's, first of all, a question about, it always goes back to what is your objective when you're asking, is it going to be worth it? So is your objective to, end up getting more funding? Well, is an event the best way of doing that? I don't know. Is it really about launching a report? Maybe, but I think that what we've also, I hope, has come across here is that there are lots of different event types. It doesn't have to be hiring a ballroom every time and having an event launch or a report launch. You can do things like webinars that maybe bring the cost down or something like that. Now, I hope I'm not calling you out on this, Sarah. I think that you might be in Lewis, which is a little bit off the beaten map in the UK, if I recall. And so that is maybe another reason to have Birmingham. Okay, good. I know that there are some places that can be a little bit more off the beaten path. And so sometimes having an event can be very worth it, especially in the UK when it's all very London-centric, to be able to get people to come to somewhere else to, well, to keep you in their minds and the front of their minds in a way that they might otherwise not be thinking about it, basically. So although there are no guarantees, the other thing that I would say is I hope that we've shown that, like, with some of the planning and making sure there's advertisements and some of the tips and things that we've said today, that it might indeed be worth it. There are ways to make it more successful.
Any other? Sorry.
Really quickly, also on that, I would say that the 10% kind of dropout rate, I think, would be very nice if it was only 10%. I've seen places, it really can depend on your location, and as much as a 50% dropout rate isn't totally unheard of. There are other things to consider, like time and things like that. If you're not in the center of town, for example, and you're holding an event, then don't have a lunchtime event so that everybody has to take an entire day out to come to it. Or if you know that people are going to have to take an entire day to come up to Birmingham, for example, then make sure that you make a full day, like make it a proper event that they can get the networking opportunities and all those sorts of things.
But yeah, you're right. I guess thinking about what your goal is probably the first thing you need to do in answering the question about whether it's worth it. Thanks for coming in on that, Jeff. Any other questions before we move on to extending the reach of your events? Okay, nothing's coming through. Over to you.
Thanks. Right, so in this last section of today's webinar, what I wanted to focus on was various ways of extending the event, of your event. Let's try that again. Various ways of extending your event. And there are three ways that I'm going to be talking about. One is live streaming, which we'll spend some time on. One is live tweeting, and other is on kind of the follow-up from the event of what happens next, basically. So let's go ahead and start with live streaming. There are a number of different technological options that you might want to investigate when you are live streaming. And this is something that these various technologies have kind of been around for a while, but I think it was with Periscope, which I'm afraid I don't remember if it's always been a Twitter company or if it was just purchased by Twitter in the end, was one of the first ones where it became really popular on social media to be able to broadcast live video just through your phone. And so Periscope and Facebook Live are both formats that allow you just with your phone to take it and say, okay, now we're broadcasting whatever is happening to us in real time. They're particularly good formats to allow for feedback. If you've watched a Facebook Live video, you see this stream of floating icons, whether it's hearts or likes or making you angry. I suppose it depends on what sort of event we're actually having. So you get some of that live feedback in there, which is also quite nice. Having said that, I don't find those two formats trying to broadcast something like a panel event very effective from just your phone. normally you need a few different video cameras, some sort of encoding software, which kind of brings it all together, and then you can do the live broadcast. And that is very possible through Facebook Live and YouTube Live and Ustream once you've pulled it into an initial encoding software. But, you know, maybe we don't have all huge budgets to try and do this. I think it's especially the case when I've tried this numerous times with think tanks, and it can really depend on the type of event, or if you have a keynote speaker, this tends to work better than if you're just having kind of a debate or some sort of, I was about to say low level, I shouldn't say that at all, just a research report launch. And I've had it where people invest a lot of time in getting this all set up for a report launch, and like 3 people maybe join the live stream, and you think, why have I spent all this money and this time getting this set up? And one thing is that then you have a recording of the event that can live on into posterity, but also, I guess what I'm also trying to say is that maybe you don't have to do it in a way that takes so much technology, so much money, and so many resources. My other sort of cautionary tale, and why I'm kind of focusing on YouTube Live today, is Ustream, I think, has now been bought out by IBM. Everybody's consolidating everywhere, aren't they? But I remember the first time I tried to set up Ustream for IDS and for an event, and everything was fine, and it was set up, and the technology was working, and randomly, or by coincidence anyway, it happened to be the Russian elections, not this most recent round, but the round before that. And a bunch of reporters were using Ustream to report on what was going on. So suddenly there was a denial of service attack on the San Francisco headquarters of Ustream, and the whole technology failed, and it happened right as we were beginning our event. And so that was a little bit of a disaster that you can't really prepare for necessarily. But I guess it's worth thinking that, you know, try and make sure that you're using as big of providers as possible. Something like YouTube or Facebook are potentially less likely to go out of service like that, let's say. And I guess the only other thing to say is just remember that in the world, especially in this modern world, we're all connected. So don't forget that. In terms of the equipment that you might need, if this is something that you're interested in, is absolutely number one, a good internet connection. This is definitely one of those cases where having Wi-Fi, even if it's your own separate Wi-Fi, is not good enough. Microphones, it can be really, well, are actually really important. The problems with having a mobile phone that is just broadcasting the event isn't the camera quality at all, it is the sound quality, because the sound that is being broadcast is coming from the phone, it's not coming from the speakers who are on the other side of the room. Making sure that you have microphones that maybe plug into a soundboard and that give you what I'm refer to throughout as system audio that you can use to actually broadcast can be really important. The soundboard just allows you to mix the different microphones if that is necessary. Audio cables you'll probably need that go around the room. The presenter laptop, this is kind of assuming that you're trying to live stream an event where you have a speaker maybe with a presentation. And what that presenter laptop will be doing is basically streaming its screen so that you have the presentation itself to cut to. The encoding computer or the laptop is the device that's actually going to be sending the feed, gathering the different feeds, putting them together and sending them up to the internet, whether that's going to YouTube or Facebook Live or some of those other platforms. You may or may not want video cameras. I'd like to have 2, so one that's pointed towards the speaker and one that is able to be pointed towards the audience. And I say video camera, but again, this is a place where your phone does work for this, as long as you're not using the sound from your phone. And of course, having tripods is something that is incredibly important for this to make sure things are stable. Otherwise, you're sitting there with your phone like this for 45 minutes to an hour or however long the event is. That can get absolutely exhausting. So what I've done is I've actually created a short video that I will make accessible to you in the Slack channel that kind of tries to give an overview of what this setup looks like in practice. And I've actually labeled each of the 3 different main devices that you need. So the presenter computer, which holds the presentation and is broadcasting its stream, the encoding computer that is bringing in all of the video and sound feeds and then sending it up to the internet, and a recording device, which can be a phone, a tablet, or a video camera that somehow is sending in information to the encoding computer. So what I've done, like I said, is well, I don't have the snazzy picture, but this is broadly what that looks like, where you have the person who is presenting here, maybe they have the screen behind them with their computer, is device number 1. The encoding computer can be on the other side of the room, assuming you have long enough cables. And the video camera is device number 3, which is kind of placed, in this case, in between. If you only have one camera, you need to place it in between the speaker and the audience so that you can turn around as necessary. But what I've done is, because this is for the YouTube Live demonstration, if you are interested in trying this yourselves, what you do need is a streaming account with YouTube. And if you want to get fancy, the way to do this, that you can send this to other locations, is through a program like Wirecast. Wirecast will set you back several $100s, so bear that in mind. If you want to do a completely free version, then all you need is a Google account. So this is the basics of streaming live events with YouTube. In your YouTube account, if those of you are familiar with it, you can go down into Creator Studio. And in the Creator Studio, you might notice that there's a whole section on live streaming. And you can start an event and create a new event. And this is where my video kind of takes over. So I'm only going to show you a short snippet of this video just to give you a little bit of an idea of what it looks like. I hope that the sound works. Let me know if for some reason it's not working. But for most events, you're going to be scheduling this in advance. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new live event. I'm just going to call it testing event live stream. And there are a few settings that are really important to think about here. First is, in this case, I'm going to keep this unlisted so that only people who have a direct link to it can have it. Many of your live events will probably be public, but this gives you a little bit more control. You can always make things public later. The other thing that's really important here is the type. We're going to use a quick setup, which uses the Google Hangouts on air. You can use a custom setup, but that requires custom encoding software, such as Wirecast, which you can download, but is a little bit beyond the scope of this video. In the event settings, the one thing that I like to really make sure is on is the enable DVR. That's digital recording, basically. And basically what this is allowing for is when somebody is watching your event, they have the ability to kind of rewind and play again. That can be really helpful if, for example, you want to screen cap an image to share on Twitter, or if you are trying to get an exact quote from a speaker and you're trying to create custom quote graphics, then that facility is extremely helpful. So we want to make sure that those two things are clicked. We would also set the time and day. I have said now before, and that has said that's before the start time. So I'm going to just say 1:30 p.m. just for fun. And we create our event. You can see now here, there's the testing event room, and there are various things that we can do, but what we want to do is actually start our Hangout on air. And as we start going, there we go, you can actually see me. Hello. And hopefully behind me, you can see that number 2. Now, right now, you already see that there's an issue because that number 2 is backwards. And that is because we need to do a few setup things here. So if you mouse over, a bar appears at your left, and there are a few things that we can do. First, the cameraman app is really helpful because it can say, if you're having people coming in, for example, if you're having somebody who's presenting not in the room, you can hide their videos or not. But the main thing that we want to do is broadcast the large video that I see to my audience and hide the other video feeds. That we definitely want to be yes. So as we start getting people on, you'll see there's lots of thumbnails that start coming in. And if you want to have all of those thumbnails in there, you keep that at no. But otherwise, if we just want this big video stream here, we click yes. That's the cameraman app. The control room is really useful. Again, as we get more people joining us, gives us the ability to mute other devices, for example. And then the toolbox is also a very useful thing for two things. First of all, you can create lower thirds. So I'll just keep on think tanks and you can choose a color. I'm wearing blue today, so why not keep it blue? Or you can turn on a custom overlay and actually have your own transparent image if you save something as a PNG. So if I turn that on, it will become a little bit more apparent that my video is backwards. That is completely fine. There's a button here where you can mirror your video. And there we go. So those are the main things that we want to have set up. We've got our lower thirds, so we know. And I think in the interest of time, I will stop it there. I go on to add the different devices and show you how to go in between them. But that video, like I said, we will share separately in case this is something that is interesting to you. I have more to go, but I suppose I should check in and see if there are any questions before I move beyond live streaming. Well, good. Hopefully that was a useful overview. And if you have questions, as always, do put them in Slack. Now, that requires a lot of technology and probably an extra person at your event who's dedicated to managing the whole live stream. One of the, let's say, lower tech versions or things that doesn't take as much bandwidth is live tweeting, and that still helps pull in people into your event and maybe get them involved. Live tweeting is something that can be done from both institutional and personal accounts. I think the main difference can often be the tone. So if you are tweeting about an event from an institutional account, it tends to be more factual, like so-and-so has just said this, and maybe with a picture of the event, or we're pleased to welcome so-and-so to talk on this topic. From a personal account, I think it gives you an opportunity to have a little bit more personality and to put your researchers or other people within the organization kind of more front and center. So maybe you could tweet saying, so-and-so just said this, but here's what our research says, or maybe it's to agree with them, not just to disagree with them. In terms of making sure that live tweeting works, make sure that you have a short and unique hashtag for the event. I see this so often where either the hashtag is something like something conference 2018 London or whatever it is. So it's a huge one. This is maybe not so much of an issue now that Twitter has gone from 140 to 280 characters, but it can really eat into it. On the other hand, if you just say the hashtag for your event is hashtag London, then you're going to get a lot of Twitter spam or people that are participating that don't know what in the world is going on. So it has to be short but unique. The next thing is that once you have a hashtag for the event, you need to make sure that people know about it. We always make sure, or we did when we were at the Nuffield Trust, make sure that the event hashtag was printed and kind of on various walls as you were entering, or that it was on holding slides or in various, on basically the title slide of every different presentation that was maybe coming up. Another way, I think this is probably becoming less common, it was more important when Twitter wasn't really a thing, was to have a Twitter wall. So people who maybe aren't necessarily just on Twitter can see what is going on and are encouraged to join that conversation. As a general rule, I like to not just tweet quotes about what so-and-so said, but to add to the conversation. Like I said, that might be more relevant from personal accounts. Do try and include pictures and videos of the speakers and presentations where possible. One of the things that's nice that if you're doing this in conjunction with a live stream of something, sometimes people wait and they actually take a screen cap of the presentation from the live stream so that it is a really nice clear version of the slide. And I think that that's also worth thinking about. You know, today restaurants actually make an effort to make sure that their food is Instagrammable. I'm going to say that that's a word. But you might just as much want to be thinking about what would make a slide tweetable. And so whether that's particular graphics or a really sharp and striking comment, that might be a way of encouraging people to live tweet or share things from the presentation. The other useful thing, if you are doing the live stream, is to, if you have that DVR function on, from our institutional account at the Nuffield Trust, for example, we would pre-prepare quote graphics in templates, and then we would have one person who was maybe listening to the conversation on the live stream and typing out specific quotes from the speakers as a way of putting them into those graphic templates and then sending them on Twitter. But with that DVR function, they were able to kind of say, wait, what exactly did they say? And kind of go back and verify that that's the actual quote of what they said. So that's another reason that live streaming can help. And so just to give you an example, this was for our annual summit. We prepared a bunch of different templates, so we knew in advance who a lot of the speakers were. We see that we have quite clearly there the hashtag NT Summit, and we have our branding, we have everything pre-prepared. Simply when it was that person speaking, we downloaded it and filled it out with whatever quote that it actually was. And you see, for example, in this case, we got 120 retweets and 81 likes, just because we were able, I don't know if it was just because we were able to put it into this more graphic template, but that certainly helped to bring this to the attention of a wider audience. That's a little bit about live tweeting. For event follow-up, I think the old approach used to be having an event report, or a video of the event and some quick takes. So those are a few different things that you might want to include in the follow-up of your event. The traditional event report maybe used to be in the form of a PDF. We've talked in previous units about kind of the death of the PDF or why that's maybe not so helpful. And I have certainly edited some of those event reports where they are pages upon pages long. This person said this, then this person said this, then this person said this. Maybe this is where I should have a poll in this and say, have any of you actually ever read an event report, a PDF of an event report? Nobody's fessing up to it, huh? Okay, oh yeah, Carolina says yes, unfortunately, oh dear. Right, so we know that that's probably not the best way of trying to capture knowledge from an event. The way that we used to kind of help do this and pull social media quotes and things together and images was through Storify. Unfortunately, that has actually ceased to function, if you can believe it. But that same sort of approach still works in terms of maybe the way that you would want to approach a blog post about an event. And basically what the Storify example is taking different tweets and different images, different videos maybe from the event, and putting that together, interweaving a little bit of text to kind of help people follow how the event worked. We talked in the last unit about Medium. this is actually probably something that you could very easily put together by on the Medium platform by embedding tweets and embedding the videos right there, which is probably why Storify kind of went out of business. But it's a good, it was a really good platform. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure why they closed. And I had a lot of think tanks around the world going, no, please bring it back. But there we are. This is an example of doing it on your own institutional website from the Brookings Institution. They had an event on financial inclusion, and you can see that they have this right as some sort of blog, but include various videos from the event in the middle of it and things like that. And they have the related content and all those sorts of things. Nope, that didn't help me click to the next one. You can, of course, host your event video if you've been capturing it as you're going along as a way of encouraging more people to watch it. I do recommend that you break it down from presentation to presentation. Having kind of an hour-and-a-half event as one video on YouTube, you're going to get a lot of fall off, and it will be easier for people to find it if you say, so for example, this is Nick Clegg, the former Lib Dem leader from the UK who's giving an event at the ODI. They just spliced his keynote, or they just cut it to his keynote speech so that people could find, okay, this is what Nick Clegg had to say. But that sort of approach can be good for people who maybe missed the event or want to follow up on the event, but isn't so great for social media. One of the ways that you can work with social media and do a follow-up event is similar to what we talked about in the podcasting unit with Jonathan about, instead of recording the entire event, encourage people afterwards to record a quick summary or video, a very quick summary of what their key points were, so that you have a way of extending the reach there. And what you'll see here is we have the subtitles directly in it. And as with any video for social media, you want to make sure that it starts right away. So there's no time for an intro or anything like that. And we've tried to keep this to, for example, about 45 seconds. So here's an example of one that we did from the Nuffield Trust following our annual summit.
The reality is we spend so much time focusing on illness and its causes. We spend so little time focusing on the science of wellness. There is now very, very clear scientific evidence that shows that the way in which we nurture children, the way in which families are supported, creates a propensity not just for wellness in the sense of health, but wellness throughout life in terms of educational attainment, engagement with the jobs market, reducing offending and so on. So focusing on the causes of wellness can lead to significant reductions in demand for public services.
So I think that's a good example. You'll see that we did it in a place where there was still a lot of buzz happening around, but it was a quick encapsulation of the main points of the speech, and it was, again, very widely shared on social media because of that. I keep on clicking the wrong place, and it's taking me to the link rather than to keeping me on the slide. I think that we are closing in on the end of this session, but I suppose it's worth asking if there are any particular questions from any of that I did on extending reach or on anything others. Sounds like an intelligent Stephen Gerrard. I'm afraid I don't know who that is, Ruben. I will have to Google.
It's a footballer.
See, okay. I probably shouldn't know, but probably shouldn't admit that I don't know.
It's all right. He's
it's cup time. It's fine. Right. Yeah. But he's not Scouse. He was from Scotland, Harry Burns. Anyway, that's fine. Good.
Sorry, I'm getting feedback on my side, so I'm going to mute myself. I don't have anything else to say.
Excellent. Same difference. Scouse is not Glaswegian. Okay, anyway, we'll argue that for next time. It seems like people are ready to sign off from this week's webinar. So you'll be very pleased to know that there is no exercise for this unit. I know that you had two in the last, the last two units did. We had a number of them come in today. What Carolina and I have decided for this is that there is one more exercise for the next unit, and we will accept up to the deadline that we set for that one, all of the previous exercises. We've needed to have, I think, some flexibility because this was a very quick course, and we know it's during summer holidays for some of you, and people have busy times at work, that sort of a thing. So please do continue to submit your exercises if you'd like, and we will be able to, we'll focus on sending feedback. I was going to say grading. We're not necessarily grading. We are sending feedback, however, after we get through the unit next week. So yes, thank you everybody. This was our last webinar on channels. Next week, Carolina and I will be back with Richard Darlington, who you had also during the beginning of this course, talking communication strategies and monitoring and evaluation. So putting it all back together now that we've gone and done these deep dives into each of the different channels. Anything to add, Carolina?
No, that's it. Thanks, Jess.
Lovely. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day or evening or whatever's appropriate wherever you are.
Bye.
Bye.